Hello, it is day 18, wow, of Can Month. Still super sick, but we are trucking on. And today we're going to be talking about The Birth House by Ami McKay. I had been obsessed with this book for so long, for some reason, because if you recall from my TMI tag, I have a fear of pregnancy. Yet I was just always so intrigued by this book whenever I would see it in like bookstores until I finally picked it up and read it for this month. And I was right. This book is incredible. It's one of my favorite books of all time. And I just tore through it like a baby tears through a vagina. Why did I say that? The book is set during World War I in Scots Bay, Nova Scotia, and the main character is Dora Rare, who is the first girl to be born into a Rare family in 5 generations. Living in the village is Marie Babineau, who is an Acadian midwife who has moved to Scots Bay from Louisiana because during the 1700s, I think it was, there was something that happened in Canadian history where all the Acadians that lived on the East Coast were forcefully deported from Canada and were forced to spread to many other places. In French it's called Le Grand Dérangement. I don't remember what it's called in English. A lot of them went to Louisiana and kind of formed Cajun culture. So Marie Babineau was moving back to her roots when she decided to come back to Nova Scotia. So she is the local midwife and healer who takes care of all the women in the village and also all the children. And she's just paid in food basically. So during the winter people would supply her with firewood, food, and that's kind of how it would go, and everyone was super happy with her and what she was doing for them until Dr. Thomas shows up. And Dr. Thomas has basically launched a campaign against Marie and all of midwifery in general, citing how it was dangerous that these country women were birthing children and how the only people fit to do that are clearly male medical doctors, and he's trying to set up a gynecology clinic in a town close to them. A lot of what this book is talking about is midwifery and women having control over their own bodies with the help of other women versus the medicalization of women's bodies. And a lot of things that they note in the story is that when there are women who do have to give birth at the clinic with Dr. Thomas, the immense amount of disconnectedness that they felt throughout the childbirthing process because of all the drugs. So they basically had no memory of what happened, and how Dr. Thomas would basically just impose his empirical knowledge on women in terms of how he would treat them without any actual understanding of them and their situations. There's also a lot of subjugating women because of made-up mental illnesses that were meant to discredit women as people. So basically, if any woman was acting outside of the norm of what she was expected to, she was mentally ill and she needed to be treated. And so a lot of this was hysteria, but as we've seen from the Victorian era, it actually became more complex and there was a lot more different conditions that were used to replace hysteria, although that is, still a main feature of it. And also how vibrators were used to treat hysteria. Like, okay. It's interesting to think about in terms of now as well, because obviously the medicalization side won. Like, that is now the norm. Like, even if you look at like the Mindy Project and how they portray the midwives there and the differences between like real medical science and midwifery. Of course there are still people who do like home births, water births, natural births, all that kind of stuff, but that's seen as being very abnormal. And this book is really about patriarchal systems of authority, really. For instance, Dr. Thomas and just how he's operating under, and then also the fact that the way that he was discrediting midwifery is he would basically turn all the husbands in the village against, midwifery and that idea, and about how Marie Babineau was incompetent and all this different kind of stuff, and how they needed to trust in him, the real doctor. And then because the husbands became convinced of this, that the wives who were pregnant had to give birth at the clinic with Dr. Thomas because men had control of women, so women were not able to give birth the way that they wanted to. So a lot of this comes through in terms of discussing families. So for instance, with Dora, she grew up with 5 other brothers and she was just like part of the family. And then there got to a certain point where her father was imposing a lot of weird gendered stuff on her. Like her mom was very cool and just trying to like let her be her. And other people in her family, especially her aunt, would talk about like how abnormal it was for her to be like reading so much. Like nothing good happens when women read too much. And it was really cool too with what she was reading as well, because she was reading like Charles Dickens and the Bronte sisters and the kind of English classics that we see now. So it's just another way that you have a connection with her, is because you're reading the same stuff. Anyway, so her aunt gave her this book basically on how women should be acting, and it's written again by a male medical doctor. There's passages from the book that Dora's reading in the book, and there's a passage about how masturbation is not only a sin, it'll like corrupt your mental faculties basically. And she's just kind of like, no, like literally how could masturbation be wrong? Like what are you even trying to say? And I was like, fucking thank you. And a lot of this book is about sex and the way that women's friendship circles would form, and a lot of what they would talk about would be around sex in terms of how to avoid getting pregnant, how to get pregnant, and just different attitudes and ideas. Another thing that I think the book touched on really well was domestic men's violence against women and why that happened and why it was evident that it was happening to everyone, but it was never talked about or actually addressed, or nothing was done about it because of how much it was accepted. And particularly with sexual violence, in terms of the author really bringing out why it was happening in this community. And again, because it's set in World War I, there is lots of discussion from Dora and no one else about suffragettes and also the pacifist movement, and how the leader of the pacifist movement in Canada was a well-known suffragette. And she also talks about and laments that she wishes that pacifism were a stance that was taken more seriously in, you know, the context of World War I, and people in Canada still deciding if they wanted to join the war efforts or not. And there's also a part in the book where she gets to go to a bigger city in America and talking about the suffragette movement there, and also its links with the queer movement. And just by the end of the book, it was just amazing, and how Dora gets to lead the life that she wants to live, regardless of what people in her village think, and how they just kind of have to deal with it and end up kind of accepting her anyway. And something else that really struck me about this book is how, like, this book is set like, right, kind of like early 1900s to like 1917-ish, and she is just a little bit younger than me through like the last half of the story, and just like how much she had to grow up, like the stuff that she was expected to be doing in terms of like marriage and whatnot. There's like a span of time where it doesn't really like talk about her age, and you realize it's only been about a year and she's like 19 and living this life and doing all this stuff, and I'm like, okay, like this is what 30-year-olds do now. This book was just perfection for me. And I know I've been focusing more on the social context of the book, but I loved the characters and the writing style and the story and everything, and how seamlessly all of this feminism was just woven into it. Like, this book is actual perfection. I still feel too invested in this book to really talk about like how much I loved it, if that makes sense.